How do you navigate this time? How are you seeing the ability for NPR to thrive and drive forward?
Well, there's certainly no roadmap for this moment in time. I think this represents a step change for all public broadcasting. It's not just here in the United States. We recognize that public broadcasters around the world are under increasing scrutiny and pressure. The good news for us is that we have a viable model because we've built audiences over the 50 years we've been in existence. We have 46 million listeners a week. And so as we look to the future, we're looking at, all right, this is a change. It doesn't change our public service mandate. It doesn't change our mission and our obligation to the American public. It just probably will change how we have to do our work.
When you say how you do your work, does it ultimately mean that you have to think about the resources that you put to work there? Can you be as expansive in the coverage that you have been for so many years?
It's a good question, and it's something we're trying to figure out. NPR received traditionally about 1% of our budget directly from the federal government. But we have just 1%. But we have a network of around 250 member stations, which received as much as 70% in rural parts of the country. And so we're waiting to see what some of the fallout will be for those stations. We have projections. We're concerned about this. And we're looking at how we can buttress some of their work by cutting fees to them and thinking about how to make, a dollar stretch a little bit further to continue to serve local communities.
Katherine, I think there would be a lot of value in you explaining the business model.
It is confusing, yes.
Well, the reason I ask actually is in preparation for today, I suddenly stopped and looked at NPR's following on social platforms, for example. It's very, very big.
Yes.
How do I consume some NPR content, like on YouTube, for example? But that isn't necessarily a big income generator for you. Is that right?
Right. So I think people think of us as radio because that's our origin. But in fact, 50% of our listening comes from digital platforms. It comes through podcasts. It comes through YouTube. It actually comes through reading online. And you can see in our numbers that our demographics are actually very well distributed. We've been accused of being too liberal. But what I can tell you is that when we look at the audience data as to who comes to us, it's actually a very representative distribution of the American public. So 50% of what we're doing is for digital audiences and 50% of what we're doing is for radio audiences. On the radio side, we have these roughly 250 members across the country. They serve 99.7% of the American public. So in some ways, we are one of the largest national networks, and we have 3,000 local journalists around the country who then serve back into the network with stories that they're filing for their local communities and for their states.
How does it make them feel when they're deemed to be too liberal? And
really not good.
Yeah.
Really not good. I mean, we have reporters who are covering tribal areas who are primarily focused on the issues of Native American communities. We have reporters in rural Alaska who are focusing on the issues that their communities face, some of the issues around, for example, fishing and access to the National Wildlife Preserve, and what does that mean for economic opportunity for Alaskans? They're having nuanced conversations that represent the full spectrum of the American debate on any of these issues. And so to be called liberal or to be demeaned in that way is really a misrepresentation of the work that they do.
Nuanced is a great word.
Yeah.
We need more of it.
Well, we try to make sure that we're hearing from all sides of the story in every story, and that means that we are representing, sure, of course, communities in California that perhaps have one point of view, but also communities in Indiana that have a different point of view.
Well, so, we talked about this as a team, and one of our producers, Zoe Thomas, brought up the idea that there is like the NPR strategy, and then there's what the local stations are doing. On the politics side of things, how are the local stations reacting, for example, if a lot of their listener base did vote for President Trump? With what's going on, how are you factoring that in? But also, in the business model, do you end up sort of also competing at the NPR level with the local station level because you're trying to pursue different subscribers, things like that?
Well, those are sort of two very different questions. I mean, we aim to serve the entire spectrum of American conversation, right? So we had the White House press secretary on just last week speaking directly to the American public about the administration's thinking on the current government shutdown. We invite members of both parties on all the time. We invite independent voices on all the time. This is important to us, but it's not just our politics coverage. It's also coverage of American life, all of the cultural aspects that make up our differences as well. And that is one of the flexibilities flexibilities of local reporting, is it means that our station in Utah can run stories about the local reaction to the Charlie Kirk assassination, as well as contributing to our national coverage so that Americans all across the country can hear from those perspectives.
What is the feedback from the American listeners about everything that's happened?
Well, I mean, on the news, of course, I think what we hear very consistently is that this is a concerning time. People dislike the amount of polarization. We do hear that our coverage and the way that we approach things tends to bring people closer to an understanding of their fellow Americans, because we really do focus on finding the personal story. We like to say that everything that happens in America happens somewhere, and so we're always trying to find the somewhere that is happening, whether it's the implications of tariffs or, you know, the conversation that's happening around, for example, Jimmy Kimmel, who you were just recently referencing.
Listeners are so loyal. You turn to them for funding. Have you seen big billionaires, big donors wanting to step up into this moment?
We have seen an outpouring of support, absolutely. So New Hampshire Public Radio, for example, raised $1 million in response to the defunding efforts over the course of a short period of weeks. We're really appreciative of this, but that won't fill the gap for these rural communities that are already socioeconomically strapped. There's a reason they have been federally funded. We know that 20% of Americans live without local news. There's a reason for that. The market conditions don't allow it, and that's where public media has filled in the gap. So that still remains a challenge. We have seen a lot of support, of course, across the board for public radio. I think there were 3 million people who wrote into Congress to support us at the time of defunding, but it won't be enough to fill the $120 million gap relative to the defunding effort.
Your own background is so fascinating, having been for a stint with the Web Summit, making huge, big events, and for a tech community. You're the chair of the Signal Foundation. You've also been at Wikipedia. I'm interested as to how, in this moment of belt tightening, your technological savvy comes into all of it.
Well, I actually think that technology is an enormous advantage for the complex structure that you have. You asked me about the business model earlier.
Yes.
And I think it's a great lead into this, right? There is a way in which we could be in competition. All of these local stations seeking to now transform their work for a national audience. Technology actually offers us the place to bring all of that aggregate reporting together. And so if somebody is running a really great story here in LA about a local band that is about to go on tour, and I reference that because music is a big part of what we do at NPR, we now have the ability to serve that to any audience member anywhere across the country who might be interested in what that band is about to do, right? We wouldn't have been able to do that in a previous era, but the ability of digital platforms, the affordances for us to serve audiences seamlessly, they don't think of us as our local station versus our local station. They think of us as one public media experience, and that's really what we're leaning into.
So Swen, what are you going to do differently, in this environment? What are you going to change to bring in more money that you need?
Well, certainly investing pretty heavily in the fundraising piece. I mean, I don't think that that's dissimilar from what we've seen in nonprofit news as a whole. We've seen tremendous success in the nonprofit news sector in building subscriptions and building memberships. That's an opportunity for us. And in fact, we've been doing it for a long time. We have millions and millions of loyal donors across the country. It's time to bring in the next generation. You mentioned I come from Wikipedia. We have a little experience in this, right? So that's one piece of it. I also think that it's an opportunity for us to think about how we're doing our news gathering and news production more effectively. And so we have all these journalists across the country. What does it mean to do the national editorial planning, where we're really thinking about how to elevate these conversations that are happening around the country into the national story? And then, of course, we have this great international and national reporting that we need to now weave into the mix.